When an atheist professor publicly mocked God in front of Barron Trump, he thought it would be an easy win. But what he got instead was total humiliation. Before we dive in, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It happened at one of those prestigious academic conferences where America's brightest young minds gather. The kind of event where professors love to show off their intellectual superiority and progressive ideals. Among the attendees was Barron Trump, who had earned his place there through academic excellence, though many whispered he was only there because of his last name. Professor Richard Anderson was known throughout academic circles for his sharp wit and sharper tongue. A self-proclaimed champion of modern thinking, he had made quite a name for himself by ridiculing traditional values, particularly Christian beliefs. His lectures weren't just classes, they were performances where faith was the punchline and God was the joke. As students filed into the grand lecture hall that morning, there was already a buzz in the air. Professor Anderson's reputation preceded him, and everyone knew his lectures were more like intellectual gladiator matches. What they didn't know was that today's match would have an unexpected champion. The professor began his lecture with his usual flair, pacing the front of the room like a predator sizing up its prey. His topic, leaving antiquated beliefs behind, embracing modern rationality. His eyes scanned the room, landing briefly on Barron. A slight smirk played at the corners of his mouth. Little did he know he was about to face the most challenging and humbling experience of his academic career. "Let's address the elephant in the room," Professor Anderson declared, folding his arms across his chest. "Studies consistently show an inverse correlation between intelligence and religious belief. In simpler terms, for those who might need it," he smirked, looking directly at Barron, "the smarter you are, the less likely you are to believe in supernatural fantasies." Several students shifted uncomfortably as Professor Anderson pulled up a graph on the screen. "See this declining line? This is what happens to religious belief as IQ and education levels rise. Fascinating, isn't it? Though I suppose some people's family traditions," another pointed look at Barron, "make it harder for them to accept basic cognitive development." From his position near the back, Professor Thompson watched with growing concern as his colleague crossed line after line. He'd seen Anderson be provocative before, but this was different. This was personal. "You know what I find truly remarkable?" Anderson continued, his voice dripping with intellectual superiority. "In this room, we have some of the brightest young minds in America. Future scientists, leaders, thinkers. Yet I guarantee some of you still cling to these primitive beliefs, unable to break free from your cognitive limitations." Barron sat perfectly still, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. Unlike the other students who either nervously laughed or stared at their desks, he met the professor's gaze with unwavering composure. This seemed to fuel Anderson's contempt even further. "Tell me," he challenged, removing his glasses and leaning forward on his podium, "what does it say about someone's intellectual capacity when they still believe in an invisible sky daddy in 2025? When their cognitive development is so stunted that they need fairy tales to explain the world?" His eyes locked onto Barron. "Perhaps some of our more politically connected students would care to enlighten us?" The tension in the room was palpable. Students watched breathless as the professor's thinly veiled attack hung in the air. But none of them, not even Anderson himself, was prepared for what happened when Barron finally stood up. "Actually, Professor," Barron's voice cut through the tension, calm and measured, "I would be happy to address your concerns about cognitive development." A smirk spread across Professor Anderson's face. Well, young Mr. Trump wants to educate us about intellectual capacity?" He gestured theatrically. "Please enlighten us about how your God fits into the modern world of quantum physics and artificial intelligence." "First," Barron replied, maintaining his composure, "I find it interesting that someone who champions intellectual discourse would resort to mockery instead of actual academic discussion." A few gasps echoed through the lecture hall. "But since you brought up cognitive development," Anderson's smirk faltered slightly. This wasn't the fumbling response he had expected. "Oh, please," he interrupted. "Spare us the Sunday school lessons. I've spent 30 years studying cognitive development. Are you suggesting you know better?" "I'm suggesting," Barron continued, his voice gaining strength, that your bias is showing, Professor. You claim to follow the evidence, yet you ignore the countless brilliant minds throughout history and today who reconcile faith and reason. Newton, Planck, Collins, ancient history. Anderson scoffed. Is God a magician too? Is that what you're going to tell us next? His attempt at humor fell flat as students watched Barron's collected response. You know what's fascinating, Professor? Barron stood straighter. You mock faith while displaying your own kind of religious devotion, a blind faith in your own intellectual superiority. You've created your own form of dogma, where anyone who disagrees with you must be cognitively inferior. The room fell silent. Professor Thompson leaned forward in his seat, watching his colleague's face redden. Anderson had encountered this level of articulation, this calm dismantling of his assumptions. His next words came out almost as a snarl. Fine, Mr. Trump, you want to debate? Let's debate. Come down here and explain to us all how your medieval beliefs survive scientific scrutiny. Show us this superior intellect of yours. As Barron began making his way to the front of the lecture hall, no one could have predicted how this challenge would end, least of all Professor Anderson himself. The lecture hall fell silent as Barron made his way to the front. Professor Anderson's stance was triumphant, clearly anticipating an easy victory over this young believer. But something in Barron's calm demeanor made a few students exchange worried glances. Since you mentioned quantum physics earlier, Barron began, his voice clear and steady, let's start there. You claim faith is incompatible with modern science, yet quantum mechanics itself has shown us that reality is far stranger than our limited human minds can comprehend. Oh, please, Anderson interrupted. Don't try to use quantum mechanics to justify. I'm not finished, Professor, Barron continued politely but firmly. You spoke about cognitive development. Let's discuss that. You argue that belief in God indicates lower intelligence, yet you ignore the extensive research showing that faith often correlates with higher resilience, stronger community bonds, and better mental health outcomes. Anderson's face twitched. This wasn't going according to his plan. Correlation doesn't equal causation, he retorted. Exactly my point, Professor. Yet you had no problem implying causation when it suited your argument about IQ and religious belief. A murmur of appreciation rippled through the audience. Professor Thompson watched as his colleague's confident smirk began to fade. But let's address your real issue. Professor, and Barron continued, you're not really angry at God or religion. You're angry at what you perceive as intellectual weakness. So let me ask you this. What's more intellectually honest? Admitting there might be things beyond our current understanding, or arrogantly claiming we figured it all out? Anderson's face reddened. That's not what... When you mock faith, Professor, Barron pressed on, you're not just mocking me or my beliefs. You're mocking the billions of people throughout history who found meaning, purpose, and profound truth in their relationship with God, including, I might add, many of the scientists whose shoulders you stand on. The professor's composure was cracking. He hadn't expected this level of articulation, this calm dismantling of his assumptions. Students who had been smirking earlier were now watching Barron with growing respect. So tell me, Professor, Barron's voice took on an edge of challenge. What's more indicative of stunted cognitive development, believing in a higher power or believing that mockery is a substitute for actual intellectual discourse? The room held its breath. Professor Anderson opened and closed his mouth, but no words came out. The silence in the room was deafening as Barron prepared to deliver his final argument, one that would leave the professor wishing he'd never started this confrontation. I'll tell you why you're threatened. Professor, Barron's voice carried clearly through the silent hall, because deep down, you know that your entire worldview rests on a fundamental contradiction. Anderson gripped the podium tighter. What? What contradiction? You claim to follow evidence and reason, yet you've made an absolute negative claim that God cannot exist. Any true scientist knows that proving a negative is impossible, so your certainty isn't scientific at all, it's dogmatic. The professor's face paled slightly. Students who had been taking notes were now just watching, transfixed. Furthermore, Barron continued, You mock people for finding meaning in faith while you've turned your own atheism into a kind of religion. You preach it with the same fervor you criticize in believers. You've simply replaced God with your own intellect. A few students nodded vigorously. Even some who had initially sided with the professor were now completely engrossed in Barron's dismantling of their teacher's arguments. But here's the most telling contradiction. Barron paused, his eyes locked with Anderson's. You argue that believing in God is a sign of lower intelligence, yet you're unable to counter even basic theological arguments from a student. So which is it, Professor? Are believers intellectually inferior, or are you just intellectually unprepared? The silence was absolute. Professor Anderson's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. His entire academic career had been built on intimidating students with his intellectual superiority. But now, here's the question that I think will really demonstrate the flaw in your thinking, Barron said, his voice calm but powerful. You argue that faith in God is irrational, yet you have faith that consciousness arose from unconscious matter, that life emerged from non-life, that order came from chaos, all without any divine guidance. So tell me, Professor, which requires more blind faith, believing in a divine creator or believing that nothing created everything? The look on Professor Anderson's face made it clear he had no answer, and that's when he knew he had made a terrible mistake in challenging Barron Trump's faith. The silence in the lecture hall was deafening. Professor Anderson stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, clearly searching for a response that wouldn't come. Students leaned forward in their seats, waiting for his rebuttal to Barron's devastating logic. Well, that's not... Anderson stammered, his academic prowess crumbling before everyone's eyes. His hands trembled slightly against the podium. The fact is, Barron continued, his voice still respectful but firm, your bias against faith isn't based on reason or evidence. It's based on prejudice, and prejudice, as you often teach, is the enemy of true intellectual discourse. That's when Professor Thompson chose to intervene. Perhaps, he called out, rising from his seat, we should return to our scheduled program. We have a lot of material to cover today. Barron, recognizing the mercy being offered to the humiliated professor, nodded graciously. Thank you for allowing me to share my perspective, Professor Anderson, he said, turning to return to his seat. The young Trump's dignified exit only highlighted Anderson's earlier rudeness. The professor stood at his podium, visibly shaken, watching as Barron walked back to his desk. The other students' eyes followed him with newfound respect. Professor Anderson attempted to continue his lecture, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. His hands shook as he shuffled his papers, and his eyes kept darting to where Barron sat, as if expecting another intellectual assault at any moment. For the next 30 minutes, Professor Anderson attempted to continue his lecture, but the damage was done. His voice, usually so confident and commanding, now wavered with uncertainty. Every assertion made seemed to echo with his earlier humiliation. Students who had once hung on his every word were now stealing glances at Barron, their expressions a mixture of awe and respect. A few were quietly taking notes, but not about the lecture. They were recording what they had just witnessed, the modern approach to cognitive development. Anderson's voice trailed off as he caught sight of Barron taking careful notes, the same composed expression on his face. The professor quickly looked away, losing his train of thought entirely. In the back of the room, Professor Thompson watched with a mix of sympathy and understanding. He had warned Anderson about his increasingly aggressive attacks on students' beliefs, but his friend had been too convinced of his own intellectual superiority to listen. The once mighty professor's hands trembled slightly as he turned to the presentation slides. The words that he had confidently proclaimed hundreds of times before now seemed to mock him. Rational thinking in the modern age. The irony was lost on no one. A student raised her hand to ask a question about the material, but Anderson flinched visibly, as if expecting another challenge to his worldview. The rest of the class passed in a blur of stumbled explanations and uncomfortable silences. Not a single person in that lecture hall was thinking about the scheduled material. They were all replaying the moment when a young man's unwavering faith and sharp intellect had systematically dismantled their professor's life's work. As the lecture finally drew to a close, The usual shuffle of students packing their bags was accompanied by an unusual buzz of excited whispers. Groups were already forming, all discussing what they'd witnessed. Did you see how he just... I've never seen anyone stand up to him like that. The way he stayed so calm while the Professor Anderson barely managed to dismiss the class. His usual authoritative closing remarks were reduced to a mumbled, "We continue next time." His hands shook as he gathered his materials, avoiding eye contact with everyone. A small group of students who had previously laughed at his anti-religious jokes now stood awkwardly by the door, watching as their once intimidating professor seemed to physically shrink behind his podium. The intellectual giant who had dominated this hall for years had been revealed as something far less impressive. "Barron," one student called out as he headed for the exit. "That was incredible." Others nodded in agreement, some even applauding. Through it all, Barron maintained his humble demeanor, politely thanking them, but refusing to revel in his opponent's humiliation. Professor Thompson approached his colleague, who was still frozen behind the podium. "Richard," he said quietly, "perhaps this is an opportunity for some reflection." Anderson just nodded, his eyes fixed on where Barron had been sitting. The young Trump's empty seat seemed to mock everything Anderson had believed about faith, intelligence, and his own intellectual superiority. The question now wasn't whether he would change his approach to teaching. It was how much of his worldview would survive this devastating encounter. As the conference concluded that afternoon, Professor Anderson was seen sitting alone in the now empty lecture hall, staring at his notes. 30 years of mocking faith were reduced to meaningless scribbles by a young man's unwavering conviction. "Excuse me, Professor." It was Barron, stopping by before leaving. Anderson looked up, his arrogance replaced by something new. Respect. "You know," Anderson said quietly, "in all my years of teaching, no one has ever made me question my own intellectual arrogance like you did today." Barron smiled graciously. "Sometimes the strongest arguments for faith are made by those who try to destroy it." The professor nodded slowly. "Maybe," he replied. "The truly closed minds aren't the ones who believe in God, but the ones who mock those who do." That day became legendary in academic circles, not just as the day when Barron Trump defended his faith with extraordinary eloquence, but as proof that when truth meets arrogance, truth always wins. The video from that lecture hall has circulated through every major university in America, reminding everyone that faith and intellect aren't enemies, they're allies in the search for truth. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching. God bless you and God bless America.